Hey guys, tonight we are plunging into a place where shadows cling a little too close, and the air feels thick as if it's weighed down with centuries of whispers. You're not in your bed anymore, at least not in your imagination. You're at the threshold of a cavern that stretches endlessly downward, where a faint growl vibrates through the stone under your feet. You can almost smell damp earth and ancient iron. That rumble, that's the sound of the guard dog of Hades. And you probably won't survive this encounter if you tried it in real life. But since this is a bedtime story, you'll walk right in. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, while you're at it, drop a quick comment with your location and the local time you're listening. It's always fun to see who's out there. Someone in New York drifting off at midnight. Someone in Sydney listening while the sun comes up. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge deeper into this cavern, each step echoing with a hollow clap. The shadows thicken until you're certain they're brushing against your arms. Then, as your eyes strain in the dark, the shape comes into view. 3 massive heads, each with teeth like chipped marble columns, eyes gleaming with firelight that isn't really there. This is Cerberus, the 3-headed hound tethered to the gates of the underworld. Ancient Greeks believed he stood at the very doorway between life and death, ensuring that no soul slipped back into the sunlight once it had crossed over. The idea of a monstrous guard dog wasn't random either. Dogs, after all, were already guardians in everyday life. Archaeologists have even uncovered dog skeletons, deliberately buried at doorways in ancient settlements, a strange ritual, echoing the protective role of animals long before. Myths gave them extra heads. The myths say Cerberus's growl wasn't just a sound. It was a warning tremor that rolled across the underworld plain. Some storytellers described his breath as so foul it could wilt flowers instantly, while others added the unsettling detail of snakes writhing across his mane. Picture that next time your dog's fur is a little tangled. Historians still argue whether these embellishments came from Greek imaginations alone, or from older myths borrowed from the Near East, where serpents were often symbols of chaos and underworld guardianship. Standing here in your mind's eye, you notice how massive Cerberus's paws are, big enough to leave craters in the soil. His claws scrape rock with a sound that might remind you of dragging a chair across tile. Except this is louder, sharper, and impossible to tune out. He doesn't lunge at you though. That's the thing, he isn't meant to hunt the living. His duty is containment, not slaughter. The shades of the dead drift past him, pale and silent, like mist shaped into human forms. They don't even glance at you. They know they're trapped forever. And yet, Cerberus is not only a monster, he's also a symbol, one that storytellers use to explore human fears of death, of boundaries, and of crossing thresholds we can't return from. The Greeks had this knack for taking ordinary fears like your guard dog barking at the dark, and magnifying them into cosmic nightmares. That's why Cerberus isn't just a dog. He's the dog you can't bribe, can't escape, and can't outfight. Unless you happen to be a demigod with very shiny muscles. But that part comes later. For now, let yourself stand here at the start of the story. The cavern air heavy and damp. The 3 heads swaying slowly like snakes charmed by invisible music. You don't run. You just watch. And somewhere in the silence between growls, you realize this is exactly where you're supposed to be tonight. You keep moving. Your steps oddly calm for someone standing within range of 3 gaping mouths full of teeth. But that's the trick of this place. The underworld doesn't run on adrenaline. It runs on inevitability. You're not supposed to fight. You're supposed to drift, to accept, to shuffle into the endless mist. And yet, standing near Cerberus, you can't help but ask, why did Hades need this particular guardian at all? Surely a locked door or a scary warning sign would have been easier. The answer is bound up in how the Greeks pictured the underworld. Hades himself wasn't exactly the cartoon villain people often imagine today. He was more like the stern administrator of an eternal bureaucracy. Souls filed in, paperwork stamped metaphorically, and once you were in, that was it. But Hades also had a problem. Mortals were persistent. Myths are littered with stories of people sneaking down here to grab loved ones, to steal knowledge, or just to prove they could. A giant three-headed watchdog? That sent a pretty clear message. No entry, no exit, no exceptions. Think of it like a supernatural bouncer. You've probably stood outside a club once, realizing the bouncer decides your fate. Now multiply that by 3 heads and make sure each one can smell fear, guilt, and maybe whether you had garlic bread for dinner. That's Cerberus. Ancient poets described him crouched at the iron gates of Hades, the very first thing souls encountered after crossing the river Styx. With the help of Charon the ferryman, picture it, a line of translucent figures waiting nervously, clutching their coins of passage, hoping the dog doesn't notice them trying to look braver than they feel. Here's where it gets interesting. A mainstream historical fact. Real ancient Greeks buried their dead with coins, sometimes in the mouth or on the eyes, specifically to pay Charon. Archaeologists have found these coins, often low-value ones. Not gold or silver, but humble bronze pieces tucked inside graves. It's one of those beautiful intersections between myth and everyday ritual. The myth of Cerberus wasn't just a scary bedtime story. It tied directly into how people treated their dead. But of course, myths never stand still. Some versions said Cerberus let souls in easily, but blocked their way out. Others claimed he lunged at anyone daring to approach without permission. Historians still argue whether Cerberus was imagined as purely destructive, or simply symbolic of the finality of death. Was he a slavering beast lunging at spirits? Or was he more like a giant lock on a door that couldn't be broken? Nobody knows for sure. And maybe that uncertainty was part of the power. And here's a quirky tidbit for you. Some ancient storytellers whispered that Cerberus wagged his tail whenever someone new entered the underworld. It's kind of funny, 3 horrifying heads snarling and snapping, while behind him a dog's tail swishes with happiness at more company. It almost humanizes him, makes you wonder if deep down he wanted companionship, even if it came in the form of dead souls. Imagine walking into the most terrifying place imaginable and realizing the guard dog just wants to play fetch. You wouldn't throw the stick. Of course, you'd be too busy questioning your life choices still. The symbolism was clear. Hades wanted his realm sealed. The world of the dead and the world of the living were meant to remain separate. Cerberus was the insurance policy. You can almost see Hades signing off the contract. Yes, giant monster dog at the door. That'll do. And for the ancient Greeks, it made sense. Dogs were loyal, they were fierce, and they were everywhere in Greek society. From guard dogs to hunting companions. Cerberus was simply the ultimate exaggeration of something they already knew well. You stand at the gate now, listening to the triple growl vibrate through the cavern walls. The shades shuffle past without resistance. Cerberus lowers one massive head, nostrils flaring as though he's sniffing your curiosity. Another head yawns wide, teeth catching the dim torch light. And the third head, well, it just watches unblinking, making sure you remember exactly where you are, in a place where rules are final, and escape is only a myth. Asterisk. You edge a little closer, not because you're reckless, but because curiosity always wins in myths and bedtime stories too. Let's be honest. The question lingers, if Cerberus is the watchdog, who in the world bred him? You don't get a 3-headed dog with a mane of snakes from the local shepherd. The answer lies in the kind of family tree that would make any therapist quit on the spot. Cerberus's parents were Echidna and Typhon, a nightmare couple if there ever was one. Echidna was known as the mother of monsters, and not in the cute Mother's Day card way. Ancient descriptions call her half woman, half serpent, living in a cave where she produced children that terrorized heroes for generations. If you're picturing some serpent-tailed mermaid lounging on a rock dial up the horror, Echidna was more likely imagined as a hulking, half-buried snake with a vaguely human torso. Her beauty so twisted that storytellers couldn't decide whether she was alluring or horrifying. Historians still argue whether Echidna represented primal chaos, or simply a creative way to explain why the world felt so dangerous in those days. Then there's Typhon, Cerberus's dad. You thought Zeus was scary with his thunderbolts? Typhon was a giant whose body scraped the sky, his hands spreading across mountains, and his head crowned with 100 dragon hisses. Some versions say his breath was fire, others say it was poison, but either way, not the guy you'd invite to dinner. According to myth, even the Olympian gods panicked when Typhon rose up, with several of them fleeing to Egypt and disguising themselves as animals just to hide. Imagine Zeus as a goose and Apollo as a crow, flapping frantically across the Nile. Hard to stay intimidated after that mental image. From this twisted union came Cerberus, just one in a brood of siblings that reads like a greatest hits album of Greek monstrosities. You had the Hydra with its regenerative heads. You had Chimera, the lion-goat-snake mashup that sounds like a failed genetic experiment. You even had Orthrus, the two-headed dog who guarded cattle for a giant. Cerberus wasn't an outlier, he was just the deluxe edition. Quirky tidbit, some poets joked that Cerberus might have been the runt of the litter, which is hilarious considering he was still the size of a small barn. But here's the detail that makes you pause in myth. The children of Echidna and Typhon weren't necessarily villains. They were challenges. Each one stood in the path of heroes, forcing mortals and demigods alike to prove themselves. Cerberus's role was less about malice and more about inevitability. Death wasn't an enemy. It was a boundary. And what better guardian for a boundary than the offspring of chaos itself? You glance back at Cerberus now, watching the torchlight ripple across his scales and fur. One head sneezes, yes, apparently even three-headed hellhounds have allergies. Another growls low like a bass note under the earth. The third licks its teeth with a tongue that seems to long for comfort. The growl reverberates through your chest like standing next to a subwoofer at a concert. Only here there's no music, just the reminder that you're standing in front of living mythology. Archaeologists sometimes stumble upon ancient vase paintings showing Cerberus being dragged by Heracles or lulled by music. But the artistic details shift wildly. Sometimes he's tiny, barely the size of a big dog. Sometimes he's gargantuan with 100 heads. Historians still argue whether the Greeks ever agreed on what he looked like, or if the image of monster dog was flexible depending on the moral of the story. Maybe it's like modern comic books, you tweak the costume for every reboot. And nobody complains too much as long as the character still gets your attention. The point is, Cerberus wasn't a mistake. He was the perfect child for Echidna and Typhon, born to guard, born to intimidate, and born to stand forever at the line no one should cross. You take a breath and realize you're not just looking at a dog. You're staring at an inheritance, the living legacy of chaos turned into order, nightmare given a purpose, and it's oddly comforting in its own terrifying way. The deeper you settle into this shadowy vision, the more the family resemblance begins to make sense. Cerberus wasn't an only child, far from it. His siblings were practically a monster hall of fame, each one waiting in the wings to torment whichever unfortunate hero happened to cross paths with them. If you've ever thought your siblings were difficult, imagine sharing the dinner table with this crew. First up is Orthrus, the two-headed dog. He's like Cerberus's less famous brother, guarding the red cattle of the giant Geryon. Orthrus doesn't get nearly as much stage time in myths, but he does pop up in Heracles' labors. Spoiler, Heracles didn't exactly handle him gently. Still, Orthrus is important because he shows a pattern dogs in myth weren't just companions. They were thresholds, protectors of wealth, herders of danger. Even with only 2 heads, Orthrus reinforced the idea that dogs were boundary keepers between worlds. Whether it was life and death or just your cows and the neighbor's cows. Then comes Hydra, perhaps the most famous sibling of them all. Multiple serpent heads, one cut off and 2 more sprouting in its place. Hydra was the kind of creature that would make you regret not bringing extra swords to the fight. And it wasn't just a scary campfire tale. Hydra was said to lurk in the marshes near Lerna, a place historians now suggest might have been associated with very real swamp gases and bubbling springs. Some fringe theories even suggest the many-headed details symbolized toxic fumes erupting from multiple vents in the ground. Historians still argue whether Hydra was just a monstrous exaggeration or an allegory for dangerous natural phenomena. Either way, Cerberus had big shoes or claws to fill living up to that kind of sibling reputation. And of course, the Chimera, a mashup so wild it sounds like a medieval doodle, lion in front, goat in the middle, snake for a tail, and oh yes, it breathed fire. If you're keeping score, that's Cerberus' sister. Makes you wonder what Echidna's version of family game night looked like. Maybe a raucous board game where fire breath melted the dice and venomous tails flipped the board. A quirky tidbit here. Ancient coins from the city of Lisha actually show Chimera stamped on them, which means people weren't just telling stories, they were putting these monsters into their civic identity. That's like a modern city putting Godzilla on its flag. Cerberus's extended family didn't stop there. Ladon, the dragon who guarded the golden apples, and Sphinx, the riddle-asking lion-woman hybrid, also get rolled into the monstrous brood depending on the storyteller. Imagine growing up in that household. You can see why Cerberus, despite his own 3 heads, might almost be considered the normal one. At least he had a clear job: guard the gates, keep souls in, and occasionally appear in myths as the ultimate boss fight. But it wasn't all doom. These monsters reflected something deeper about the Greek worldview. They weren't just scary for the sake of it. Each one stood at a threshold between life and death, ignorance and wisdom, chaos and order. Cerberus was the underworld threshold. Hydra, the threshold of impossible combat. Chimera, the threshold of nature's unpredictability. Orthrus, the threshold of wealth and its guardianship. The Greeks basically turned their anxieties into living creatures, then told stories about heroes facing them head-on. You picture Cerberus now, sitting back on his haunches, all 3 heads scanning the cavern like security cameras. One ear twitches at phantom sounds, another snarl echoes low. He's not just a guard dog, he's a reminder that boundaries exist for a reason. His siblings roamed, destroyed, threatened, but he stayed. And that consistency is what makes him so compelling. Archaeologists digging up pottery often find scenes of Heracles fighting not just Cerberus, but his siblings too, all painted on wine cups and jars. It's a reminder that these stories weren't bedtime tales for kids, they were part of daily adult life, swirling around as people drank, gossiped, and toasted to heroes who somehow survived facing the family from your nightmares. You stand in that cavern, glancing at the shadows behind Cerberus. For a second, you imagine Hydra's many heads weaving in the dark, or Chimera's fiery breath painting the rock walls red. They're not here tonight, of course, but the memory of them clings to Cerberus like the faint smell of smoke on someone's jacket. He is, after all, the heir of a monstrous dynasty. You've already met Cerberus's unsettling family, and now your eyes drift past him toward the gates he guards. The gates of the underworld aren't polished marble arches or shining brass doors, they're more like jagged thresholds carved from the earth itself. The ground shifts underfoot, damp and uneven, as if the soil resents being walked upon by the living. Beyond those gates stretch the rivers of Hades, each one winding like dark veins through the cavernous landscape. The Greeks described several rivers in the underworld, each with its own personality. Styx, the most famous, was the river of oaths. Even gods swore by it, and breaking an oath sworn on Styx meant a divine punishment worse than your boss catching you forgetting to reply to an email. Then there was Lethe, the river of forgetfulness. Souls drank from it to erase memories of life, a detail that gave birth to endless debates about whether rebirth meant freedom or oblivion. Historians still argue whether Lethe was purely symbolic or tied to real rituals in mystery. Cults where initiates may have ritually forgotten their former identities. You imagine standing at the banks of one of these rivers. The water doesn't sparkle, it slithers. The sound is more hiss than burble, like snakes whispering to each other. The air carries the faint tang of minerals, almost metallic, like licking a coin. You probably shouldn't drink it, though, unless you're aiming for amnesia as a lifestyle choice. And in the distance, the faint cries of shades rise and fall, a chorus of voices that never reaches harmony. The gates themselves are said to have been made of adamant, a mythical unbreakable substance, harder than diamond and colder than iron. Homer and Hesiod toss around that word like it's an everyday material, but historians still argue whether adamant was purely literary or a poetic way of describing steel. Before Greeks had perfected it, whatever it was, in your mind's eye, it glints with a light that isn't sunlight, because down here, sunlight is just a memory. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some ancient storytellers claimed the underworld had multiple entrances, scattered across Greece. One was said to be near Cape Tainaron in the Peloponnese, another near Lake Avernus in Italy. Locals actually treated these places as dangerous people avoided them, believing they leaked fumes or connected to the realm of the dead. In fact, Lake Avernus got its name from the Greek word for without birds, because apparently the gases rising from it were toxic enough to kill birds in flight. Imagine strolling by that lake with a picnic basket, probably not the best spot for date night. Cerberus, of course, sat at the main gate, the one everyone had to pass through after Charon's ferry docked. You picture him pacing, his claws scraping across stone, his breath fogging the air. The shades drift past, transparent forms brushing the gates as if they can't believe this is really their final stop. And behind those gates, the rivers weave together into a labyrinth, leading to the fields of asphodel where most souls end up, not exactly heaven, not exactly hell, but a kind of eternal waiting room. The geography of the underworld was never completely agreed upon. Some poets said there were distinct realms for heroes, villains, and ordinary folk. Others blurred the lines, focusing more on the act of crossing over than on what lay beyond. And that ambiguity is part of what makes Cerberus's role so chilling. You don't need a full map of the afterlife to understand the importance of a guard dog at the door. The simple message is enough. Once you're in, you don't leave. You shift your weight, feeling the cold stone under your feet. The torchlight flickers, and for a moment, you swear the shadows of the gates stretch upward like skeletal fingers. One of Cerberus's heads swivels toward you, a low growl rattling through the cavern. It's as if he's reminding you that these aren't just stories, they were maps of belief. Carved into memory, painted onto pottery, whispered in ritual. And now you're standing at the threshold, seeing it all for yourself. You've stared long enough at the gates and rivers. Now your eyes are drawn back to Cerberus himself, and the details you missed at first glance start to crawl into focus. 3 massive heads loom over you, yes, but it's the mane that makes you flinch because it isn't fur at all. It writhes. Where you expect tufts of hair, there are snakes, their scales glistening, their tongues flicking the damp air. Some writhe lazily like they're half asleep. Others coil tight, ready to strike at anything foolish enough to come close. The ancient poets didn't all agree on how he looked. Some said he had just a few serpents twined around his neck like grotesque jewelry. Others went all in, claiming his entire mane was alive, a wriggling crown of venom. Historians still argue whether this detail came from Mesopotamian influences, where snake-headed monsters were common, or if it was simply the Greeks doubling down on their favorite symbol of danger. After all, nothing screams "do not pet" like a mane that hisses at you. Look closer. One of the heads yawns, jaw stretching unnaturally wide, and you notice saliva dripping onto the stone. Instead of ordinary drool, it bubbles faintly, hissing as if acidic. The smell is sharp like rust and vinegar mixed together. Some versions of the myth insist that wherever Cerberus's saliva fell, poisonous plants sprouted. Later storytellers even claimed aconite, also called wolfsbane, grew from his spit. Quirky tidbit? Aconite is a real plant, genuinely toxic, and ancient Greeks did use it in small, horrifying doses as a poison. It's possible the myth was an imaginative explanation for why this nasty plant grew near rocky ground. And the eyes, don't forget the eyes. Each head has its own pair, glowing faintly in colors you can't quite pin down. One looks molten gold, the next a smoky red. The last a greenish shimmer that feels like watching swamp water ripple in moonlight. When they blink, it isn't synchronized, which makes the whole effect unsettling. As though 3 different minds are judging you at once. You feel smaller under the triple stare, like you've been caught sneaking cookies from a kitchen where the chef is also a dragon. Mainstream fact: multi-headed beasts weren't unique to Cerberus. Ancient Near Eastern art often showed composite monsters. Think of the lamassu, the winged human bull lions that guarded Assyrian palaces. The Greeks may have drawn inspiration from these, blending familiar animals with impossible features to create guardians of their own. Cerberus, then, wasn't just a Greek invention. He was part of a larger Mediterranean tradition of mixing awe and terror into protective figures, and yet, even with all this horror, there's something dog-like about him. Watch closely. One head twitches its ears when a shade passes by. The way your dog perks up at the sound of a snack bag crinkling. Another head huffs impatiently, breath-puffing warm clouds, like he's bored of seeing the same old procession of souls every night. For a flicker of a second, you can almost imagine throwing a stick. Almost. But then one of the snakes in his mane rears up, tongue flickering, and the fantasy evaporates. Historians still argue about the number of heads, too. 3 is the most popular, but some sources mention 50 or even 100. Heracles dragging a 100-headed beast would be less practical for a vase painting, but the exaggeration tells you something. The scarier the description, the stronger the boundary felt. Imagine seeing a mural with 100 heads, each snapping at once. You wouldn't just hesitate, you'd pack up and decide maybe the underworld wasn't worth visiting after all. You take another step closer, just enough to hear the snakes more clearly. They hiss in layers, creating a strange, almost musical chord that resonates against the cavern walls. It isn't loud, but it prickles your skin. Cerberus tilts one head as if curious, while the other to keep scanning, ever vigilant. He's grotesque, yes, but also magnificent, the kind of presence that freezes you in awe. And tonight, in the safety of your bed, you can linger without fear, marveling at how myth can turn a dog into a living fortress of flesh and fangs. You stand there entranced, wondering why the Greeks chose 3 heads in the first place. Not 2, not 4, not an awkward 7.5, but 3. Numbers meant something in myth, and 3 was a favorite. Think of the fates, spinning, measuring, and cutting the thread of life. Think of the 3 Gorgons, the 3 Graces, the 3 trials heroes often faced before proving themselves. 3 was balance, rhythm, completeness. So, when Cerberus shows up with 3 heads, it isn't just a creepy design choice. It's a symbol. One common interpretation was that the 3 heads represented time itself, past, present, and future. Imagine a dog that can sniff not only the ground you walked yesterday, but also the path you'll take tomorrow. That's not just a guard, it's a cosmic tripwire. Another idea. The 3 heads symbolize the stages of life: youth, adulthood, and old age. Cerberus, then, wasn't just blocking the gate of the dead. He was reminding everyone of the cycle that gets you there in the first place. Historians still argue whether the Greeks consciously attached these meanings, or if later philosophers layered them on. But either way, the triad sticks. Mainstream fact. The number 3 shows up across cultures as a sacred or mystical unit. In Pythagorean thought, 3 was the first real number because it had a beginning, middle, and end. Stories became more memorable when structured in 3s. A pattern still alive today in everything from fairy tales to stand-up comedy. The Greeks, whether deliberately or instinctively, tapped into this rhythm when shaping Cerberus. Here's a quirky tidbit to tuck away. In some rural parts of ancient Greece, people would braid charms in 3s, 3 knots, 3 strands, 3 herbs, believing it added magical strength. So, when poets described Cerberus with 3 heads, listeners might have nodded along, thinking, yep, that's the strongest dog possible. Imagine showing up to a guard station and finding not 1 suspicious Doberman, not 2, but 3, fused together. You turn around without asking questions. And yet, there's another way to see it. 3 heads meant 3 different personalities. Some poets hinted that 1 head was fierce, another was cunning, and the third almost playful. Think of the awkwardness of having your moods triple exposed at once. 1 head ready to bite, another ready to bargain, the last wagging its tongue like an idiot. You'd never win an argument with yourself again. The image makes you chuckle quietly, though the sound echoes a little too loudly in this cavern. Cerberus shifts on his paws, and you swear each head reacts differently. The left one narrows its eyes, suspicious of your laughter. The middle one growls low, serious as a lecture hall. But the right one sneezes, a wet dog-like snort that sprays a little mist. For 1 absurd second, you're reminded that even supernatural hounds aren't immune to dust. 3 heads don't mean 3 tissues, unfortunately. Still, the symbolism carries weight. 3 heads watching from 3 directions meant no escape. A single guard can be distracted. 3 can triangulate. No soul slips past unnoticed. The Greeks may not have had CCTV cameras, but they invented the mythological equivalent, complete with glowing eyes and venomous accents. Cerberus wasn't just terrifying. He was efficient. And in the glow of your imagination, as you watch him curl and uncurl, you realize how comforting that might have been to the living. Yes, he was monstrous, but he ensured the order of the cosmos. No chaos, no wandering spirits, no dead neighbors showing up awkwardly at the market. 3 heads meant certainty. 3 heads meant finality. And in the ancient world where life was fragile and uncertain, maybe that finality was its own strange kind of reassurance. The longer you stare, the more you realize the Greeks themselves couldn't quite agree on what Cerberus looked like. You've seen him described with 3 heads, of course, but also with 50 or even 100, each snapping in chorus like the world's most nightmarish choir. Some vase paintings show him almost dog-sized, barely larger than a mastiff, while others render him so huge that Heracles looks like an ant yanking at a mountain of fur. And fangs. Historians still argue whether these shifting images were mistakes in transmission, deliberate exaggerations, or just artists getting creative after 1 cup too many of strong wine. One version paints him less like a dog and more like a hybrid of lion's body, dragon's tail and bristling snake mane. Another stretches him into something almost wolfish, lean and sharp, with eyes glowing like embers in the dark. And then there's Hesiod's wild claim in Theogony that he had 50 heads, which makes you wonder if Hesiod was really describing a monster, or just trying to one-up every storyteller at the time. 3 heads? Cute. Mine has 50. Beat that. It's the ancient equivalent of inflating your Dungeons and Dragons stats. Here's a mainstream fact. Greek myths weren't standardized. Unlike a single holy text, myths shifted depending on the region, the poet, or even the pottery workshop. That's why you'll see different versions of Cerberus cropping up across Greece. Some Athenians painted him lean, Spartans beefed him up, and Roman poets later streamlined him into the classic 3-headed hound. If you're looking for consistency, you won't find it here. Greek myth was a collaborative fanfiction project running for centuries, and tucked in there is a quirky tidbit in certain later accounts. Cerberus was said to have not just a dog's tail, but a dragon or serpent tail that hissed and struck independently. So, technically, you weren't facing 3 heads. You were facing 3 in the front, plus 1 bonus snake bit in the back. Imagine trying to sneak past that quietly tiptoeing around the dog's heads, only to get nipped by a tail that's basically a 4th head. Talk about unfair game mechanics. Some scholars argue that this patchwork of features reflects how myths absorbed local symbols. Lions represented power in Mycenaean Greece, serpents symbolized rebirth and the chthonic world. And dogs, well, dogs were already guardians in daily life. Mash them together and you've got a creature that practically shouts. Threshold a head turned back now. Historians still argue whether Cerberus was always intended as a cohesive figure, or if he was a walking collage of cultural fears. But here's the thing. No matter the version, wolfish, lion-bodied, dragon-tailed Cerberus always stood at the same spot, the gates of Hades. That consistency matters more than the head count. He was less about his appearance and more about his function. He embodied the line you didn't cross, the rule you didn't break. You could quibble about details, but the core remained solid. Cerberus is there to stop you. You glance at him again. Tonight, in this sleepy dreamscape, he looks like the classic 3-headed dog. But the shadows twitch, and for a split second you could swear there are more than 3 heads turning, growling, whispering in unison. Maybe 3, maybe 50. Maybe the uncertainty is part of his menace. Your mind fills in the blanks, and the blanks are never kind. One head yawns, another snarls. The 3rd snaps at a snake slithering from his mane. And the tail? You can almost hear a faint hiss from behind, reminding you that in myths, danger doesn't just face forward. Sometimes it sneaks up from the rear. You blink slowly, as though the air itself is thick with drowsy weight, and your gaze shifts back to the steady flow of souls. They shuffle toward the gates without protest, without conversation, without anything resembling willpower. And that's where Cerberus comes in, not just as a monster, but as the ironclad rule that death is final. Cerberus's job wasn't complicated. Let the dead in. Don't let them out. He wasn't chasing after spirits like a dog herding sheep. He was an immovable obstacle, a breathing embodiment of inevitability. In most versions of the myth, he didn't bite the shades. They slipped past him like mist through stone. But if one tried to turn back, to claw toward the surface world again, well, that's when the growling deepened into action. His 3 heads lunged, his teeth snapped, and the snakes of his mane hissed in chorus. You don't need to imagine gore to feel the warning. Escape was not an option. Here's a mainstream fact to anchor this ghostly imagery. The Greeks truly feared restless dead. Archaeologists have unearthed graves where bodies were pinned down with heavy stones, or bound with iron shackles. These weren't accidents. They were deliberate precautions against corpses rising. Cerberus wasn't just a bedtime monster, he was the mythological version of those same precautions, scaled up until no mortal could argue with it. And here's a quirky tidbit. A few ancient writers hinted that Cerberus might actually greet new arrivals with a wagging tail, almost like a welcoming committee. Then, once they were inside, the wagging stopped and the guarding began. It's a strangely domestic touch for such a beast, as though even the underworld needed someone to say, "Welcome home, forever." You almost picture him standing at the gates like a twisted Walmart greeter, except with fangs instead of smiley stickers. Still, not everyone agreed on whether Cerberus was purely terrifying. Some scholars point out that dogs weren't only symbols of menacing Greek life. They were also protectors of households, loyal companions, and hunting partners. Cerberus, then, was double-sided, monstrous enough to terrify intruders, but loyal enough to serve Hades faithfully without question. Historians still argue whether he was seen as evil, neutral, or even oddly noble in his role. Imagine the scene again. You're a soul, newly dead, standing at the edge of the Styx. Charon ferries you across, his boat scraping against stone as you step off. You shuffle in line with hundreds of others, the cavern echoing with a soft, endless murmur. Then you see him, 3 heads tracking the crowd like searchlights, ears twitching at invisible sounds. You don't run, you know better. You just lower your gaze, shuffle past, and feel his breath ripple over you like a furnace draft. You've been admitted, and you won't be leaving. Cerberus doesn't snarl at every shade. He doesn't need to. His presence alone is enough. It's the kind of quiet authority you felt before the teacher who never raised their voice, but made you sit up straight anyway. The security guard who didn't even check your bag but still made you feel guilty. Multiply that by 3 heads and a mane of snakes, and you've got a guardian no one dares to test. Tonight, in this dream, you stand outside the line, watching the soul slip through. One of Cerberus's heads swivels toward you. Another growls faintly. The third, oddly enough, just sniffs the air, as though wondering whether you're truly alive. The truth is, you are but here in the underworld. That's starting to feel like a technicality. You linger at the gate, watching shades drift by, and you start to wonder what happened when someone living stumbled this far. After all, myths love sending mortals where they don't belong. Cerberus may have been designed to stop souls, but stories are full of unlucky wanderers who found themselves face to face with him, and trust me, it rarely ended in a pleasant belly rub. Most mortals who dared approach the underworld weren't exactly adventurers. They were desperate. Some wanted to bring back a lost loved one, others sought forbidden knowledge, and a few were just plain foolish. In nearly all these stories, Cerberus is the first wall they hit. He doesn't pounce immediately, he's not a jump scare kind of monster, but the tension he creates is worse. Imagine being a trembling farmer or grieving widow sneaking through a cavern, clutching a torch, and suddenly hearing 3 growls harmonizing in the dark. That sound alone would send most people sprinting back to daylight, if they were lucky enough to make it. Here's a mainstream fact. Ancient Greeks genuinely believed in dangerous borders between life and death. Sanctuaries like Eleusis conducted rituals where initiates symbolically descended into darkness, before being reborn into the light, a dramatization of entering the underworld. To the participants, that was as close as you could get without actually dying. Cerberus embodied the reason you didn't try the real thing. Quirky tidbit time. Some fragments suggest that villagers used to tell cautionary tales to children about people sneaking too close to cave mouths where vapors leaked out. The warning always ended with "and then Cerberus got them." Kind of like how modern parents say, "Eat your vegetables or the monster under the bed will come," except here. The monster had 3 heads and a professional contract with Hades. Take, for example, the myth of Theseus. Yes, the same guy who fought the Minotaur. In one less told story, he tried to march into the underworld to help his buddy Pirithous kidnap Persephone. Terrible plan, by the way. Cerberus stood ready at the gate, and while Theseus didn't die immediately, he ended up trapped, literally stuck to the ground until Heracles came later to pull him free. Historians still argue whether this was meant as a cautionary tale about arrogance, or just a side plot to highlight Heracles' heroism, but either way, Cerberus played his role, no mortals out of place. Another shadowy tale involves a nameless shepherd who supposedly wandered too far into a cavern near Cape Tainaron. He was said to have heard barking echoing from the depths before his body was found lifeless. Days later, whether it was toxic gases or just campfire gossip, locals swore it was Cerberus who got him. And honestly, that's the power of myth. You don't need a body count. You just need the rumor of a monster at the threshold, and people will stay away. You glance at Cerberus now, imagining those unlucky intruders standing where you stand. The middle head growls at the thought, a low rumble that shakes dust from the cavern ceiling. The left head narrows its glowing eyes as though remembering every foolish mortal who tried to pass. And the right? It yawns unimpressed, like it knows humans will never stop doing ridiculous things. And it'll always be there to remind them of the rules. In this way, Cerberus wasn't just a guard dog, he was the embodiment of consequence. He didn't chase mortals across Greece, didn't haunt their dreams, didn't need to. He simply waited at the one place everyone feared to go, and if you wandered in anyway, well, that was your choice. You gambled with 3 mouths of teeth, and odds were never in your favor. You've seen how mortals usually fared when they stumbled toward the gates, but myths also love a clever twist, and one of the most famous involves a man whose only weapon was music. Orpheus the poet, the singer, the guy who could strum a lyre so beautifully that rivers paused. Trees leaned in, and wild animals forgot to bite, decided to walk right into the underworld. Not for sightseeing, of course. He was trying to bring back his beloved Eurydice, and the first obstacle in his way, Cerberus, planted firmly at the gate like a nightmare doorman. Now, normally, Cerberus was not in the mood for visitors, but Orpheus wasn't carrying a sword or even a handful of honey cakes. Instead, he carried a song. He plucked his lyre, sang of love and grief, and poured his heart into the air like honey spilled on stone. And here's the miraculous part. Cerberus listened. The snarling jaws quieted, the glowing eyes softened, and all 3 heads sank into a sort of drowsy trance. Imagine the ultimate guard dog transformed into a puppy dozing off during lullaby time. The snakes in his mane even sagged, their hissing muted into soft sighs. Mainstream fact. The Greeks believed music had genuine power, not just to entertain, but to heal, soothe, and connect with the divine. They used music in rituals, healing practices, and even battle marches. Orpheus's tale wasn't just fantasy, it reflected a cultural conviction. That music could reach places swords never could. Quirky tidbit. Some Roman versions of the story claimed that Orpheus didn't just lull Cerberus to sleep, he actually made him cry. Yes, picture 3 massive heads, fangs gleaming, shedding tears while listening to a sad song. That's the kind of myth detail that makes you tilt your head and wonder if the ancients were slipping in a bit of humor. 3 heads bawling in harmony. Imagine the sound of that ugly crying. Historians still argue whether the Orpheus myth was meant to emphasize love's power, art's triumph, or simply to caution against disobedience. Remember, he famously looked back at Eurydice before reaching the surface, breaking the rule and losing her forever. But for Cerberus's role, the message was clear. Even the most monstrous threshold could be crossed, not with brute strength but with beauty. That's a rare loophole in Greek myth, where most problems are solved by swinging a club. You picture it now. The cavern, usually trembling with growls, suddenly filled with melody. The The torchlight flickers softer, as though the music itself reshapes the air. Cerberus curls on the stone like a colossal house pet, eyelids drooping. One head rests against its paws, another yawns a sleepy sigh, and the last lets out a huff that sounds suspiciously like a snore. The shades, silent as ever, shuffle past, almost reverent of the moment. For once, the threshold is unguarded, lulled into stillness by a song, and you standing there in your dream catch yourself smiling. Because even in the underworld, even in front of a beast bred from chaos itself, music softens the edges. It's almost enough to make you hum a little tune yourself, though you wisely keep quiet. After all, you don't have Orpheus's voice, and waking up a three-headed dog isn't the best way to end a bedtime story. The melody of Orpheus fades into silence, and for a moment the underworld feels heavier again, as if it regrets letting its guard down. But myths have more tricks up their sleeves than music alone. Sometimes, all it took to bypass Cerberus was snacks. Not grand offerings, not magical weapons, just a little food for the road. Enter the story of Psyche, a mortal woman sent on a series of impossible tasks by the jealous goddess Aphrodite. One of these tasks required Psyche to travel into the underworld itself. You can almost picture her, trembling yet determined, clutching a handful of honey cakes baked for the journey. These weren't just desserts, they were the ancient equivalent of bribes, packed specifically for Cerberus as she approached the gate. There he was, 3 heads watching, 3 sets of nostrils flaring, 3 throats rumbling with suspicion. But Psyche didn't run, didn't argue, didn't even strum a lyre. She simply tossed the cakes, and Cerberus, for all his monstrous features, still had a bit of ordinary dog left in him. He gobbled them down, one head after another, distracted long enough for Psyche to slip through the gates. It's almost comforting to think that no matter how terrifying the myth, even the 3-headed guardian of death had a weakness for snacks. Here's a mainstream fact. Honey cakes, or ****, were genuine offerings in Greek funerary practice. Families often left them at graves or used them in rituals to appease chthonic deities. The myth of Psyche reflects a real cultural detail. Food was a bridge between the living and the dead. And here's a quirky tidbit. Some later storytellers joke that Cerberus's heads didn't always agree on food. One head supposedly loved sweets, another preferred raw meat, and the third would eat literally anything, garbage included. Imagine the chaos at dinner time, 3 mouths arguing over the menu. It's an oddly domestic image for a creature otherwise dripping with menace. Historians still argue whether Psyche's passage was meant to show divine favor, feminine cunning, or simply the idea that clever preparation could outwit brute force. Whatever the case, Cerberus's role was once again to enforce the boundary, and once again, he was undone by something deceptively small. Not brute strength, not magic, just kindness to an appetite. You watch it play out in your mind. Psyche's hands tremble as she tosses the cakes, the cavern echoing with the wet crunch of teeth snapping through sweetness. One head licks its chops, another head glares suspiciously, but can't resist, and the last head whines impatiently for the next bite. The snakes in his mane wriggle lazily, almost relaxed. Psyche slips past, her shadow melting into the crowd of shades, and Cerberus, distracted, lets her go. And you realize the lesson hiding here. Even monsters bred from chaos can be swayed by something simple, something human, something ordinary. It makes you wonder what might distract Cerberus today. A ball, a squeaky toy, or maybe just the smell of grilled chicken drifting across the sticks. Whatever it is, for one moment, you can't help but chuckle at the thought of the deadliest watchdog in myth wagging his tail. For dessert, the tale of Psyche drifts away, and your attention shifts to another wanderer who dared step across the threshold. Aeneas, the Trojan hero destined to found Rome, guided by the Sibyl, a priestess whose words dripped with prophecy. Aeneas journeyed down into the underworld. His mission wasn't to steal or bargain, but to seek wisdom, to meet his father's spirit, and to glimpse the destiny that awaited his descendants. And as always, the very first obstacle was Cerberus, the Sibyl. Wise and calm, carried the tools for the journey, the golden bough, a sacred token demanded by the spirits, and a cake laced with honey and soporific herbs. When they reached the gate, Cerberus growled, his 3 heads weaving in suspicion, the snakes in his mane flicking their tongues. Aeneas, spear in hand, tensed for a fight, but the Sibyl had no intention of wrestling with chaos. She tossed the drugged cake. Cerberus devoured it in greedy gulps, each head snatching a piece, and then, like a creature lulled by the world's heaviest Thanksgiving dinner, he slumped onto the stone, his paws stretching out, his head lowering into a deep, enchanted sleep. Mainstream fact, Virgil's ***, where this story appears, was more than just myth, it was political propaganda. Written in the reign of Augustus, it connected Rome's founding back to Troy, granting legitimacy to Rome's empire. Cerberus's appearance wasn't just scary decoration. It was a way to show Rome's heroes surpassing even Greek obstacles. Quirky tidbit in some later retellings. Cerberus's snores during this episode were said to shake the cavern so hard that stalactites rattled loose. Imagine 3 heads snoring in sync, except, knowing Cerberus, they weren't synced at all. One head rattling like a chainsaw, another wheezing like a broken flute, the last whistling through a tooth gap. Terrifying and hilarious at the same time. Historians still argue whether Virgil invented the drugged cake trick himself, or borrowed it from older folklore. The overlap with Psyche's tale suggests the motif of bribing Cerberus with food was already popular. Virgil just added a Roman polish. Aeneas doesn't rely on personal charm like Orpheus, nor on desperate courage like Theseus. He succeeds through ritual, order, and the wisdom of his guide. Very Roman of him. You picture the scene. The cavern is silent except for Cerberus's snores. Aeneas steps past cautiously, gripping the golden bough like a lantern. The Sibyl moves with practiced calm, her eyes reflecting the faint glow. Behind them, the watchdog lies sprawled, all menace temporarily undone by a well-placed snack. Even in myth, sometimes the scariest thresholds can be crossed by patience and preparation, not just brute strength. As you watch them disappear into the shadows, you can't help but wonder how Cerberus feels about this arrangement. Does he wait later, groggy, embarrassed, maybe promising himself he'll resist the next treat? Or does he not care, knowing that in the end, everyone who enters stays anyway? Either way, the gates remain his domain, and no golden bough or enchanted pastry can change that for long. The stories of Orpheus, Psyche, and Aeneas have shown you clever ways mortals snuck past the hound. But there's one tale that looms larger than all the rest, one that cemented Cerberus's fame as the ultimate test of strength, the 12th labor of Heracles. By this point, the demigod had already wrestled lions, cleaned stables that would have made a janitor weep, and slain monsters that most people wouldn't even want to see in a sketchbook. And just when he thought he'd earned some rest, King Eurystheus gave him the cruelest task yet: march into the underworld and bring back Cerberus himself. No bribing this time, no music, no cakes laced with herbs. The labor was designed to be impossible. Eurystheus probably smirked when he assigned it, thinking, that'll be the end of him. After all, Heracles would need to cross into Hades, confront the Lord of the Dead, and somehow drag back a beast that not even the gods cared to fight. Mainstream fact, the labors of Heracles were likely stitched together from local myths and hero tales, then codified into a single cycle much later. By the time the 12th labor was added, Heracles had become the ultimate Greek hero, and his confrontation with Cerberus was the climactic proof of his endurance. And here's a quirky tidbit. Some vase paintings show Heracles descending with a lion's skin draped casually over his shoulders, and a simple wooden club in hand. No special armor, no gleaming sword, just a man, a cloak made of a lion he already killed, and the confidence of someone who's really bad at saying no to dares. When Heracles reached the underworld, he didn't sneak past Cerberus. He negotiated with Hades himself. The god of the dead laid down one condition: Heracles could take Cerberus, only if he subdued him without weapons. No sword, no arrows, no club, just his bare hands. Historians still argue whether this detail was meant to emphasize the hero's physical strength, or his submission to divine rules. But either way, it raises the stakes. You picture Heracles standing at the gates, squaring off against the hound. 3 heads growl in unison, the snakes hiss, the ground trembles. The shades step back, eager for a front row seat to a spectacle they won't soon forget. Cerberus lunges, jaws wide, snapping with teeth like tombstones. And Heracles, muscles coiled, does the unthinkable. He catches him, arms lock round the beast, wrestling against claws, fangs, and coils of living serpents. It isn't pretty, it isn't quick, but slowly. Through sheer stubbornness, Heracles drags the dog into submission. Imagine the sound. Growls and roars echoing through the cavern. Stone cracking underpaws. The rasp of Heracles' breath as sweat pours down his face. No music, no snacks, just raw struggle. And somehow, impossibly, Heracles wins. He pins the hound, holds fast until Cerberus stops thrashing, and then drags him forward. Toward the surface. It's the mythological equivalent of lifting an impossible weight at the gym. You can almost hear an ancient bard saying, "And then he benched 3 heads and a mane of snakes, no big deal." And so begins the most astonishing sight the mortal world would ever see. Cerberus, dragged from his shadowy home, squinting under the daylight he was never meant to endure. But that, of course, is the next part of the story. Heracles has never been one for subtlety. When he stepped into the underworld with Hades' grim condition echoing in his ears, he knew this wasn't going to be one of those trick the monster with a song moments. No, this was going to be a contest of raw strength, flesh against flesh, will against inevitability. And Cerberus, snarling, snapping, hissing from mane to tail, was waiting for him. The hound lunged first. All 3 heads came down in a blur of teeth, each snapping with the sound of stone cracking. One head clamped onto Heracles' lion-skin cloak, another snapped at his arm, while the third went for his leg. The snakes in his mane struck wildly, their hissing a furious chorus. But Heracles, half god and wholly stubborn, planted his feet in the cavern floor. His muscles bunched like coiled ropes as he wrestled the beast, one hand gripping a throat, another forcing back snapping jaws. Mainstream fact. Wrestling wasn't just a pastime for the Greeks, it was sacred, a test of physical and moral discipline. The Olympic sport of pale asterisk was a proving ground for strength and endurance. Myths often exaggerated it, turning wrestlers into heroes who could topple giants. Heracles pinning Cerberus wasn't just spectacle, it was an ultimate extension of a cultural obsession with grappling. Quirky tidbit, one later, Roman writer claimed that Heracles got so wrapped up in the struggle that he accidentally kneed Cerberus in the stomach, causing the dog to vomit poisonous bile. From that spill, the deadly plant aconite supposedly sprouted on Earth. Which means, if you're ever weeding a patch of wolfsbane in your garden, you could blame it on Heracles' clumsy footwork. The fight was relentless. Heracles roared with effort, veins straining, sweat pouring down his brow. Cerberus clawed at him, teeth sinking into the lion-skin cloak, but that hide already proven against arrows and blades held fast. Slowly, agonizingly, Heracles wrapped his arms around the beast's middle, squeezing with the force of a vice. One head snapped, another howled. The third bit down hard enough to make sparks fly from Heracles' shield-like shoulder. And still, the hero held on. Historians still argue whether this myth symbolized mankind's triumph over death, or simply the reminder that even death itself could be subdued but only temporarily. After all, Heracles didn't get to keep Cerberus. He could only borrow him, prove his strength, then return the beast to his rightful post. Finally, with a sound like a landslide, Cerberus buckled. The great paw scraped helplessly against the cavern stone, claws gouging trenches. Heracles heaved, dragging the dog forward step by step toward the exit. The shades gasped in unison, a ripple of awe sweeping through the ghostly crowd. You can almost hear them muttering like spectators at an ancient wrestling match. He's actually doing it. He's dragging the dog of Hades. You picture it vividly now, Heracles' arms locked tight. Cerberus thrashing, the snakes of his mane flailing like loose whips. The cavern walls tremble with the force of their struggle, dust falling in lazy spirals. And through it all, Heracles refuses to let go. A living contradiction to the very law Cerberus embodied. No one leaves. Tonight, in this dream, you can almost feel the vibration of his roar and the thunder of Cerberus's claws. A clash so primal it reverberates across centuries. You've seen Heracles wrestle Cerberus into submission, But the real spectacle came after the moment he dragged the beast upward, toward the daylight no underworld creature was ever meant to see. Imagine it, Cerberus's paw scraping across stone, gouging trenches as he resisted with every ounce of monstrous strength. Heracles, sweat slick and grim, hauling the writhing bulk inch by inch through twisting tunnels, each headfoot differently, one snapping at his arm, another howling like a storm, the last twisting sideways, trying to bite its own leash of muscle and sinew. And then came the surfers. For the first time, Cerberus's eyes blinked against the sun. He had lived his entire existence in the gloom of Hades, surrounded by shadows and flickering torchlight. Now, rays of daylight stabbed his retinas and the hound reeled. The middle head snarled in agony. The left head whined like a frightened pup, and the right head spat foam, as though the very light was poison. Mainstream fact. Greek myths often emphasized that beings of the underworld couldn't withstand the world above. Hades himself rarely left his realm, and when he did, myths described the earth trembling. Cerberus's recoil at sunlight reinforced the boundary between worlds. Some things were never meant to cross. Quirky tidbit: a few versions of the story say that as Cerberus thrashed in the daylight, children from nearby villages watched in awe, describing him later as a giant shaggy bear with 3 mouths. One can only imagine that tale being whispered around family fires, morphing into folklore that blurred the line between truth and tall tale. Historians still argue whether these local sightings were literary flourishes or evidence that myths were deliberately tied to physical landscapes to make them feel real. Heracles didn't parade Cerberus through city streets like a circus act. No, he dragged him straight to King Eurystheus, the nervous little monarch who had ordered the impossible labor in the first place. Eurystheus, the man who had once hidden in a storage jar just at the mention of Heracles' strength, reportedly panicked at the sight of Cerberus. Imagine being so terrified that you assign a task thinking it'll kill someone, only to find the hero standing at your doorstep with the monster in tow, panting but alive. You dive headfirst into the nearest jar to dot. The struggle wasn't just physical. Symbolically, Heracles was hauling death itself into the light of the living world. For once, mortals could look upon the unseeable, confront the terrifying, and marvel that it had been overcome. But the victory wasn't permanent. After showing Cerberus to Eurystheus, Heracles dutifully dragged him back into the underworld, returning him to his gate. The rule was clear. Even heroes don't get to keep death as a trophy. You can almost see Cerberus stumbling back into the gloom, 3 heads shaking, tail lashing with fury and relief. The snakes hiss louder, comforted by the familiar shadows. The hound slumps at the gate once more, scarred but undefeated. And as the cavern swallows him again, the sunlight fades from his memory like a bad dream. For you, standing in this bedtime vision, the image lingers, the clash of realms. Light and dark colliding for one brief, impossible moment. And then balance restored, Cerberus back on guard, the threshold secure again. The echoes of Heracles and Eurystheus fade, and you're left gazing at Cerberus not as a mythic obstacle, but as an artistic subject, because for all his terror, the Greeks and later the Romans loved to paint, carve, and etch him onto nearly everything: vases, amphorae, drinking cups, even temple walls. You might expect those images to be uniform 3 heads, snarling teeth, serpentine mane, but no. Just as the myths varied, so too did the art. Some vase painters rendered him lean, almost wolf-like, his 3 heads more curious than ferocious. Others gave him bulky, mastiff-style bodies, paws as wide as shields, and in some depictions, especially early ones, he had only 2 heads, or a dragon's tail sprouting behind. The visual grammar wasn't set in stone. Historians still argue whether these inconsistencies came from artists, misunderstanding oral stories, or deliberately choosing what looked coolest on a curved vase. Surface mainstream fact, one of the most famous depictions of Heracles and Cerberus, comes from a black figure amphora now in the Louvre. It shows Heracles dragging the hound, all 3 heads straining backward, while Athena stands nearby as if supervising the myth's execution. This was a common theme, gods popping into the artwork to make sure the story looked official. Quirky tidbit, in some of these artistic scenes, Cerberus looks a little underwhelming. On one vase, he's drawn barely bigger than a farm dog, tugging awkwardly against Heracles' leash. You can imagine the owner of that cup sipping wine and chuckling, "This is the beast of Hades. My cousin's hunting dog looks scarier." Maybe artists had deadlines to sometimes the monster just ended up looking like a grumpy beagle, with extra heads. But the art tells you something deeper. Cerberus wasn't just a creature of fear, he was part of the cultural wallpaper. A figure so recognizable that people wanted him on their everyday objects. Picture yourself at a symposium, reclining on a couch, drinking wine with friends. You pass around a cup etched with the image of Heracles and Cerberus, and suddenly you're all swapping your favorite versions of the tale. He wasn't just myth, he was conversation starter, dinner entertainment, a shared visual language. And then there's the Roman spin. On mosaics and wall frescoes, Cerberus often looks more disciplined, more symmetrical, almost like a military guard dog. Romans, obsessed with order and authority, polished the chaotic Greek version into something that fit their worldview, still terrifying, but also obedient, part of a system rather than pure chaos. In Pompeii, fragments of a mosaic even show him leashed, snarling but restrained, which says something about Roman taste for depicting control over the wild. As you imagine these artifacts, the cavern walls are our new shimmer into painted pottery, flickering black figures on clay. You see Heracles straining, Cerberus thrashing, Athena calm in the background. Then it shifts into a Roman mosaic, tidy and precise, every fang evenly spaced. And through it all, you realize that Cerberus's image wasn't just fear, it was art, identity, even humor. Humans needed him to look scary, yes, but also recognizable, portable, fit for display on a table where wine flowed and jokes were told. Cerberus the monster, Cerberus the guardian, Cerberus the party decoration. Strange company, but somehow it works. The painted vases fade from your mind. And now you hear words instead of images, poetry, chants, and fragments of songs where Cerberus slips into verse. Poets weren't content to leave him as just a monster. They wove him into metaphors, symbols that stretched far beyond the underworld's gates. Because when you have a three-headed dog that keeps souls locked away forever, you've got an easy stand-in for all kinds of human fears. In Hesiod's lines, Cerberus is brute chaos. In Pindar's odes, he's the watchdog that heroes must tame to achieve glory. Later, in Roman poetry, Virgil turns him into the ultimate checkpoint, fall asleep with honey cakes, and destiny can proceed unhindered. And still later, philosophers like Plato dropped Cerberus's name in dialogues as shorthand for the animalistic side of human nature. Historians still argue whether Cerberus was meant to be real within myth, or always a metaphor waiting to be stretched. Mainstream fact, by the classical period, Cerberus was so recognizable that simply saying his name conjured the whole underworld setting. Tragedians used him almost like stage shorthand. If someone mentioned Cerberus, the audience immediately pictured shadows, sticks, and eternal no-exit rules. That's narrative efficiency at its finest. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some later poets joked that Cerberus represented nagging wives, greedy creditors, or any threefold nuisance in daily life. Imagine sitting in a crowded market, listening to a bard compare the underworld's hound to your landlord pounding the door for rent. It's myth repurposed as stand-up comedy, and you can almost hear the chuckles ripple through the crowd. Cerberus also became shorthand for the inevitability of death itself. Poets would say things like "no man escapes the hound" when they meant nobody cheats mortality. It's grim, yes, but also oddly reassuring. The rules are the same for kings and beggars, soldiers and shepherds. Nobody argues with a three-headed dog. You picture Cerberus now, sitting at the gate not as flesh and fur but as an idea, an embodiment of every locked door, every deadline, every unchangeable law of existence. One head watches your past mistakes, another stares at your present struggles, and the third peers into your uncertain future. You realize how much poets loved that triple vision. It wasn't just scary, it was useful. And yet, for all this metaphor, you can't quite shake the image of him wagging his tail for honey cakes. That's the charm of myth, isn't it? It lets one creature be many things at once: terror, symbol, joke, guard, and pet. And in that layered complexity, Cerberus stopped being just a monster in the shadows. He became something more enduring, a metaphor humans could carry in their pockets, whisper in verses, and paint onto walls whenever they needed a reminder that some boundaries simply hold. The voices of Greek poets fade, and you hear new echoes, Latin syllables, medieval chants, and the scratch of quills on parchment centuries after the original myths. Cerberus didn't retire after the classical age. He morphed, adapted, and reappeared in the Christian and medieval imagination, reshaped to fit new fears and new allegories. One of the most famous appearances is in Dante's Asterisk Inferno Asterisk. You drift now into that vision, where Cerberus isn't guarding the gates but the third circle of hell. There, the gluttonous writhing cold, filthy mud while endless rain pours down, and above them crouches the hound howling. Dante describes him with 3 throats, 3 sets of teeth, a belly swollen with hunger. Instead of stopping souls from leaving, this version devours the damned, ripping them apart with his claws. It's a terrifying update, one that fit the medieval Christian obsession with sin and punishment. Mainstream fact: Dante didn't invent this habit of recycling Greek monsters. Medieval Europe often absorbed classical myths and reinterpreted them through a Christian lens. Cerberus became less a symbol of inevitability and more a punisher, an embodiment of sin's consequences. In this form, he lived on not as a myth but as moral instruction. Quirky tidbit: a Renaissance scholar once complained that artists kept painting Dante's Cerberus with fluffy, almost cartoonish dog heads. Instead of horror, the images looked like a 3-headed puppy rolling in mud. You can almost imagine someone sighing. No, he's supposed to be terrifying, while their patron just wanted a cute fresco for the dining hall. Historians still argue whether Dante meant for his Cerberus to be purely allegorical or whether he was borrowing details from ancient Roman interpretations that had already blurred the lines between monster and metaphor. Either way, the medieval Cerberus gained weight literally and symbolically, becoming gluttony incarnate. Not just a watchdog but a devourer. But he wasn't confined to Dante. Other medieval texts turned him into a gatekeeper demon, sometimes giving him wings or extra claws to match Gothic tastes for excess. Alchemists referenced him as a symbol for substances with triple natures. Even illuminated manuscripts tucked him into their margins, a little doodled reminder that the world of the dead wasn't so far from the world of the living. You picture it now, Cerberus looming over sinners, his 3 heads snapping, his body bloated, his eyes rolling in eternal hunger, and then the image softens into inked lines on parchment, gold leaf glinting as monks worked by candlelight, turning the old Greek hound into a Christian cautionary tale. He is still there, still snarling, but he has changed. No longer just Hades' pet, now he's a symbol in a world where sin, not chaos, is the enemy, and through that transformation, you see how myths survive, not by staying the same, but by changing just enough to keep frightening us in new ways. The medieval shadows dissolve, and suddenly Cerberus is everywhere again, on comic book panels, in films, in pixelated video games. He's left behind monasteries and parchment, leapt into pop culture, and picked up some flashy upgrades along the way. You might even have fought him yourself if you've ever sunk hours into an RPG, where the final boss was a 3-headed beast breathing fire from every mouth dot in modern fantasy. Cerberus often shows up as shorthand for Ultimate Guardian. Video games like Asterisk Final Fantasy Asterisk or Asterisk God of War Asterisk throw him at players as a massive multi-phase battle. First the fire breath, then the poisonous bite, then the endless spawning of smaller hell puppies. Hollywood films prefer to make him bigger, sleeker, often rendered with glossy CGI so his eyes gleam like molten glass. He's been reimagined in Asterisk Harry Potter Asterisk as Fluffy, a 3-headed dog who dozes off when lulled by music, yes, straight out of Orpheus's playbook, but with a wink to younger audiences. Mainstream fact: the use of Cerberus as a pop culture figure exploded in the 20th century, when publishers and filmmakers mined Greek myths for ready-made monsters. By World War II, even alike code names borrowed mythic creatures. And Cerberus appeared in naval operations and propaganda. His brand was recognizable enough to feel both ancient and intimidating. Quirky tidbit: a Japanese manga once reimagined Cerberus not as a hound at all, but as three identical high school girls sharing one body, bickering constantly over snacks and homework. It's absurd, but it proves how flexible the myth has become. If you can turn him into either a terrifying video game boss or a comedic anime character, he's more than just a monster, he's cultural clay. Historians still argue whether this pop culture saturation dilutes the original myth's meaning, or keeps it alive in ways the ancients couldn't have imagined. Is Cerberus still a threshold guardian, or is he now just a brand mascot for scary but cool? Either way, he's stuck around longer than most comic book characters, and that's saying something. You watch him morph before your eyes. 1 second he's towering over Dante's Sinners. The next he's a snarling CGI beast on a cinema screen. Then a cartoonish dog snoring on a trapdoor while a flute plays nearby. The details change. Sometimes he has scales, sometimes slobber, sometimes goofy cross-eyed faces, but the core remains. He guards something you want but can't reach. And you chuckle softly, realizing that somewhere out there, a teenager is probably button-mashing furiously right now, trying to beat Cerberus in a boss fight, unaware they're wrestling with a monster born thousands of years ago in the minds of Greek poets. The underworld's watchdog has gone global, and he isn't going anywhere anytime soon. The pop culture echoes fade, and you find yourself wondering, was Cerberus unique? Or did other cultures also dream of terrifying dogs at the threshold of death? The answer, unsurprisingly, is that humankind seems to have a collective imagination when it comes to monstrous guard dogs. Across the world, myths feature hounds whose job is eerily similar: keep the living and the dead in their proper lanes. In Norse mythology, for instance, there's Garma, the blood-stained hound chained at the gates of hell. He isn't three-headed, but his howling is said to signal Ragnarok, the end of the world. Some scholars even call him the Norse Cerberus, though others bristle at that label. Historians still argue whether Garma was originally a distinct figure, or just another name for Fenrir, the giant wolf destined to devour Odin. Either way, he's a reminder that the North had its own underworld watchdog. Travel further east and you find Hindu stories about Sama, the divine bitch of the gods, and her offspring, the Ceremaeus, who guard the path of the dead. In the Rig Veda, these dogs of Yama, the god of death, are described as four-eyed and terrifying, guiding souls along their journey. Imagine Cerberus, but split into two dogs with spectral eyes watching from all sides. Quirky tidbit: some villagers in India still offer food to stray dogs during rituals, believing they serve as messengers of Yama. That practice echoes Psyche's honeycakes in a strangely comforting way. Mainstream fact: Indo-European myth traditions share overlapping motifs: underworld rivers, ferrymen, and yes, dogs. Scholars trace these parallels back to prehistoric times, suggesting that long before Greek poets gave us Cerberus, there were already stories of canines guarding the afterlife. It's one of those moments when myth feels less like local invention and more like a shared human memory, even in Mesoamerican mythology. The Aztecs believed that Xoloitzcuintli dogs guided souls across the river to Mictlan, their land of the dead. Archaeologists have found clay figurines of these dogs in graves, as if ensuring no soul had to travel alone. And in Celtic lore, spectral black hounds called *Cecien Ankh prowled the other world, their howls chilling enough to freeze mortals in place. Different lands, different names, but always the same idea: the afterlife needs dogs. You glance back at Cerberus, and for a moment his three heads blur into other forms: a blood-stained wolf, a four-eyed hound, a sleek hairless Xolo standing watch. They're all guardians, all boundary keepers, all reflections of our unease about what happens after the last breath. Maybe humans, no matter where they live, couldn't imagine death's doorway without a dog sitting right there, watching. And honestly, it makes sense. Dogs have been with us since prehistory, protecting camps, warning of intruders, comforting us in the dark. When we dreamed of the great unknown, we simply magnified the companion we already trusted and feared, the dog. Sometimes it had one head, sometimes three, sometimes glowing eyes or flaming breath. But the job was always the same: guard the gate. The thought of global death dogs lingers as you drift further into the cavern, and the air thickens with the scent of earth and smoke. This time, you're not just seeing myth, you're seeing traces of real practice. The way ancient people honored and feared what Cerberus symbolized. Archaeology steps in where poetry leaves off, and it tells its own eerie story. Excavations across Greece have uncovered dog burials placed deliberately near thresholds, doorways, gates, even the entrances of city walls. These weren't ordinary pets laid to rest. They seem to have been sacrifices, guardians stationed in death as they had been in life. Mainstream fact in Corinth and other Greek sites: skeletons of dogs have been found interred near the foundations of homes and temples, suggesting a ritual function. The living world mirrored the myth: the gate needed a guardian, whether of brick or of shadow. And here's a quirky tidbit. At one site, archaeologists found a dog skeleton buried alongside a miniature bronze collar, engraved with what may have been protective charms. Was it a beloved pet honored in death, or a symbolic gesture to create a spiritual guard dog? Either way, it's oddly touching, a hint that people wanted Cerberus's job replicated in miniature for their own households. Historians still argue whether these practices were directly linked to Cerberus, or simply parallel traditions that predated him. Was the watchdog myth born out of real rituals, or did the rituals take inspiration from the myth? It's the eternal chicken and three-headed dog question. Further afield, Roman funerary art often depicted real dogs guiding the dead, sometimes alongside Mercury, who doubled as psychopomp. In Pompeii, mosaics of dogs complete with the famous cave cannon warning blur the line between real guard dogs and their mythological counterparts. Maybe the people walking across those mosaics each morning felt reassured, knowing they had protection both in this life and the next. You picture it, a family in ancient Athens, burying a small dog at the threshold of their home, whispering prayers that its spirit will guard them against wandering shades. Or a Roman artisan carving Cerberus onto a tombstone, ensuring that the soul inside wouldn't wander where it shouldn't. These practices show you that Cerberus wasn't just a story. He was an idea woven into daily life, into stone, soil, and ritual. Here in the cavern of your imagination, you can almost see the echo's little ghostly dogs padding along beside the monstrous hound, reinforcing his watch. Cerberus doesn't guard alone. He stands at the head of a tradition, one paw in myth, one paw in real-world belief. And suddenly, his presence feels even heavier. Not just as a monster, but as a reflection of how much humans needed to believe the gates of life. And death had guards posted on both sides. The bones in the earth fade from sight, and your thoughts shift back to the scholars, scribes, and professors who've wrestled with Cerberus in their own way, not with muscle or honey cakes, but with words. Because if you ask 10 experts what Cerberus really meant, you'll get at least 11 answers. Some argue that he was nothing more than a literal watchdog, exaggerated into nightmare form by storytellers who knew that dogs already symbolized loyalty and ferocity. Others claim he was an astral figure representing constellations that guided souls across the sky. Historians still argue whether the 3 heads pointed to 3 visible stars, or whether that's just modern over-interpretation trying to read astronomy into everything. Mainstream fact: the earliest references to Cerberus, like in Hesiod's Theogony 7th century BCE, focus less on symbolic depth and more on his raw ferocity. He's listed alongside other children of Echidna and Typhon, suggesting that, at least initially, he was simply one monster in a vast family tree of chaos. The symbolism seems to have deepened later as philosophers and poets layered meaning onto him. Then there's the psychological camp. Some scholars interpret Cerberus as a projection of humanity's instinctive fear of death. The 3 heads, they argue, aren't literal. They represent the 3 ways we try to resist mortality: denial, defiance, and acceptance. A quirky tidbit here: in the 19th century, one eccentric German folklorist insisted that Cerberus symbolized indigestion, the 3 heads representing belching, nausea, and heartburn. That theory didn't exactly catch on, but you have to admire the creativity. Comparative mythologists bring their own debates. Was Cerberus influenced by Mesopotamian or Anatolian underworld beasts? Did his snake mane mirror older serpent guardians from the Near East? Or was he a purely Greek invention shaped by the landscape of caves, sulfur vents, and real dogs growling at the edges of villages? Nobody agrees, and maybe that's the point. Cerberus thrives in ambiguity, and then there's the question of morality. Was he evil? Neutral? Loyal? Some call him a monster, others a servant of divine order. He doesn't roam killing innocents. He simply enforces the rules. In that sense, he's less villain and more function a cosmic customs officer checking passports at the border of life and death. Not glamorous, but essential. You picture the debate swirling like shades themselves. Professors waving papers in crowded halls, philosophers pacing in candlelight, poets scribbling marginal notes. Each head of Cerberus becomes a different interpretation, myth, metaphor, or monster. And through it all, the hound keeps watching, unbothered by human arguments. He doesn't need to mean anything. He just asterisk is dot asterisk, and perhaps that's the secret. The more scholars pry, the more Cerberus slips away, reminding us that some myths aren't puzzles to solve but mirrors to stare into. You bring your own fears, your own questions, and the three heads simply reflect them back at you, each one whispering a different truth. You've walked with Cerberus through myths, rituals, art, and debates, and now you start to sense what he has always been, less a beast of teeth and claws, more a mirror for humanity itself. What does a three-headed dog say about us? That we fear boundaries and yet we need them, that we dread endings and yet we insist they exist. Cerberus is the line drawn in fur and fang, saying, here is where you stop. Mainstream fact. Greek religion thrived on duality's Olympus above, Hades below, day and night, order and chaos. Cerberus was one of the clearest personifications of that tension. His entire role was to enforce the duality of life versus death, a reminder that no matter your status, no matter your wealth, everyone meets the same guardian eventually. A quirky tidbit lightens the thought, some late. Roman graffiti in Pompeii actually sketched a three-headed dog with a comically long tongue, and the caption "Beware the dog," a playful riff on the everyday warning sign *cave canem*. Even in antiquity, someone was already turning Cerberus into a joke, proof that humans cope with fear by doodling it on a wall and laughing. But beneath the humor, Cerberus's lesson hums steady. You can bribe him, trick him, wrestle him, even drag him into the light, but you can't erase him. He always returns to the gate, settles back into the shadows and waits. And that cycle reflects the human condition itself. We try to distract ourselves with art, philosophy, jokes, even snacks, but the threshold remains. Historians still argue whether Cerberus was intended as a monster of terror or a servant of order. Maybe he was both. Maybe that's the secret to his endurance. He embodies our contradictions. Loyal yet terrifying, monstrous yet necessary, absurd yet awe-inspiring. He's the reminder that every story ends, but also that endings give stories shape. You glance at him one last time in this section. The three heads sway slowly in the dark, eyes glimmering. One seems to mock you, one seems to pity you, and the third seems indifferent, as if to say, you've always known this truth. And you realize the ancient Greeks, in all their creativity, handed us not just a monster, but a riddle one you feel rather than solve. Cerberus is the boundary, and boundaries, however frightening, are what let us sleep at night. The cavern feels quieter now, as though all the echoes of myths, poems, and arguments have folded back into the stone. Cerberus sits where he has always sat at the gate, watchful, patient, eternal. His three heads sway in rhythm, one growling faintly, one yawning, one simply staring with the kind of steady gaze that makes you shiver. Even as you feel oddly comforted, you realize you've walked a long way tonight, through his monstrous family tree, through rivers and gates, through honeycakes and golden boughs, through wrestling matches and snoring mosaics, through metaphors and modern boss battles. And yet, you always return here to the dog who waits. Mainstream fact, of all Heracles' 12 labors, dragging Cerberus to the surface was considered the greatest. precisely because it blurred the boundary between life and death. Few myths dared to put a living hero inside Hades and back out again. It was proof that even death could be faced if only temporarily. Here's a quirky tidbit in some village traditions. People claimed you could hear Cerberus's bark rumbling during earthquakes, as if he was shifting restlessly in his cavern. Not exactly scientific seismology, but it shows how deeply he rooted himself in imagination. Every rumble, every unexplained noise, could be the hound reminding mortals he was still on duty. Historians still argue whether Cerberus is best understood as a monster of chaos, a servant of divine order, or simply a mythological expression of mankind's fear of endings. But maybe the real truth is simpler. Cerberus is the reminder that no threshold is ever unguarded. We put locks on doors, guards on walls, even warning signs on front lawns. The Greeks just exaggerated that instinct into a dog you could never ignore. You linger a moment longer in this dreamscape. The torches sputter, the air cools. Cerberus lowers his head to his paws, not asleep, not fully awake, just resting in the eternal patience of his post. The gates behind him glow faintly with that metallic shimmer of adamant, unbreakable, eternal. And you understand this is where the story always ends and where it will always begin again. Now, as the journey winds down, the pace slows, like footsteps fading along a quiet road. You breathe softer, deeper, letting the weight of myth sink gently into the background. The monstrous dog recedes into shadow, not menacing now but distant, a symbol fading into mist. The cavern feels less like a place of fear and more like a cave of sleep. Its walls holding you gently in the hush of stillness. You imagine the growls softening into a low hum, like a lullaby woven from stone and shadow. The torches dim until they are no brighter than fireflies, floating lazily, blinking out one by one. Cerberus curls at the gate, three heads sinking down in unison, eyes closing. Breaths evening into a steady rhythm. He doesn't vanish. He simply becomes part of the dark, a guardian waiting until the story is needed again, and you safe, small, wrapped in blankets of myth and imagination, find yourself drifting too. The underworld no longer presses close. The rivers run quiet, the gates stand firm, but the fear has ebbed away. What remains is calm, final, certain. A threshold you don't need to cross, not tonight, not yet. So you let go of the weight of the story. Let your eyelids grow heavy. Let your thoughts blur like shades dissolving into mist. Somewhere far away, the three-headed hound keeps his post, but here, in your own world, you can rest. You are safe. You are held. And the night itself, like Cerberus, will guard your sleep until the dawn comes softly.